I was Ethiopian until I was about 8 years old. It wasn't until I came to the United States that I actually became black. Um, and that's just the truth of it. I identify as a black man because it is simple in that when people think about race, they're not thinking about the complexities that an academic or a philosopher, etc., is thinking about. They're thinking this person is a particular color relative to other people on a color chart. My name is Nahom Abegaze. I was born and raised in Ethiopia. I am now a naturalized citizen in the United States, and I'm a staff at MIU. I work as Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion. I identify as an Ethiopian and an American. Because I was born and raised in Ethiopia, I can't remove those cultural roots, and they very much shape who I am. And my everyday, my day-to-day life has a Ethiopian flavor to it. The foods that I try to eat, and culturally, like my social attitude, if you will. I also, while I appreciate the individualism of the Western culture, I really believe in a more collectivist culture. And so you'll see a lot of these sort of aspects of my life are very Ethiopian in nature. But because I've spent most of my life here, a lot of people would actually just think I'm American. A lot of people assume that I'm American. They don't even know I speak another language. My mom is half Oromo and half Amara. My dad is 75% Amara and 25% Oromo. Something like that. I think based on the calculation, I've figured out I'm about 75% Amara and 25% Oromo. The Oromo are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, and the Amara are the sort of socially and politically social and political majority. Even though they're not the majority of the population, they represent that. And so Ethiopia's national language is Amharic. That's what I grew up speaking. That's what's taught in schools. That's what's used in business, etc. So I learned Amharic, and I lost a little bit of it in the transition to the United States. I was about 8 years old when I moved here, so it was a pretty early age. I had to pick up English pretty fast. And so for a while, I had lost Amharic, but now I'm happy to say I can speak it fluently and professionally. There's a little bit of shame, quite honestly. I would like to be able to read and write the language, and the fact that I can't do that does kind of itch on a deeper level. And people are very encouraging. They're like, oh, you can learn, you can do this, and I know I can deep down. It's just that I haven't really made the time for that, and so. Yeah, Ethiopia, as enough people might know, especially around these parts, Ethiopia is known for its cuisine and its rich culture, its coffee, its dances, sort of its diversity in terms of ethnic and tribal groups. Ethiopians are also very prideful people, and they have discernible features. And so, like as an Ethiopian, even though most Americans, or enough Americans, don't know how to discern between different members of the African community. Most people even say things like, oh, Africa, in talking about a particular country or something like that. But we know that Africa is actually extremely diverse as a continent, and it's the largest continent on the planet, and yet we still talk about it as though it's one big thing. And so Ethiopia, for me, is very discernible, and I can actually discern between different tribal groups. In Ethiopia, I can discern between different Africans. I can look at someone and say, they're from West Africa, they're most likely from this country, or they're from southern part of Africa, or the northern or central part. Other aspects of my life where the Ethiopian flavor comes out are in my tendencies and proclivities around food and kind of like community. So in Ethiopia, in Ethiopian culture, it's a blunder to eat alone. And if you were in a room and you were hungry and there was someone else in that room, you wouldn't eat without them. You would absolutely invite them to eat. Even if you had just seen them eat, it would be completely rude to not say, "Hey, come on over, let's eat. Let's eat." And in fact, you would offer it 3 different times. So you say, "Let's eat." And the person would be like, "Oh, thanks so much. No thanks. I recently ate." "Oh, come on, let's eat." "No, really, oh, come on, please just come take one bite." And this sort of dance is completely appropriate and an essential part of the culture. You really want to make the person known. You really want to make them know that they're invited, that they're part of that sort of ceremony, and that it would sort of warm your heart if they would join you. And Ethiopians, despite how much money or resources they have, will give generously. Will host you, will host you with everything they have. In many ways, guests are treated, like gods. That you give everything, you give of yourself, and you give everything to them. You offer them everything, again, even if they've already eaten or drank or whatever, even when they've shown up. So at my house, this is the case. Anytime I eat, I invite others to eat with me. I try to have the sort of like family meal with my roommate or anyone who's around. And also, when it comes to dancing, Ethiopians have particularly unique dances, and I like to think that I can, I could enumerate more on that, but it's just that I have that particular rhythm and syncopation of the music works really well for me. It actually gives me a deep appreciation for syncopation and other cultures' music. So those are some of the ways in which I think the Ethiopian flavor comes out. So Ethiopian flavor for me means a particular knack for like spicy food and very flavorful food. So spicy, like in that it's hot, and we have definitely a high tolerance for spicy food, most of us. And then we also like lots of flavors. So comparable to like the curries and different spice blends that people experience in Indian food, there are a lot of spice blends in Ethiopia. The most famous one is called berbere. It's like a blend of about 12 to 20 different spices, and it is killer in terms of how good it is. But don't take my word for it. What I like about being an American and living in the United States is that the culture here really encourages people to be sincerely and authentically themselves. In many ways, that's my take on individualism. And that has allowed me to express myself, at the finest level. And that's not necessarily the culture that I come from in Ethiopia, where people are traditionally encouraged to kind of conform to the broader cultural group, the collective. So that's one of my biggest things. I think I've been able to be more expressive of myself because, we are all our own unique fingerprint. Ironically, what I dislike about being in the U.S. is the exact same thing. The focus on individualism and hierarchical individualism has meant that people are often willing to compete with one another in order to get somewhere, in order to climb the corporate ladder, or in order to just get somewhere. Like, when I look at the culture of Hollywood, for example, or the culture of that industry, it feels very much dog-eat-dog, non-cooperative, overly competitive, and doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day, other than a few people make it to the top, and everyone is sort of fighting middle-class sort of fights to make it to the top, even though a very small fraction of them will do that. And so I think it breeds a particular type of incoherence in the culture that I've come to really dislike, or at the very least have a hard time appreciating, even though I know it can benefit people like me a whole lot. So I came here when I was 8 years old, and there are many things that I miss about Ethiopian culture and being in Ethiopia. Many people don't know that Ethiopia, even though it's an African nation, is actually mostly highlands. And so I grew up on average about 7,000 to 8,000 feet of elevation, which means that the air is typically cleaner and thinner. And because of its height and placement near the equatorial line, it's also a tropical environment. So we are known for saying that Ethiopia has 13 months of sunshine. So I miss that year-round kind of perfect weather, because it's never humid, it's never too hot. It was never like that for me. There are also, as I've said, cultural things that I really cling to, which is like this, the people's sort of openness and receptivity to one another's love and affection, and the true investment in the collective. What feels like, when you're having an interaction with someone, again, they're asking you 3 to 5 times, hey, how are you doing? How's your family? How's school? How's work? It's a very devoted sort of interaction, whereas here, you see someone and you're like, hey, what's up? And you keep walking. It's not even like there's much of an exchange, or the how are yous are usually met with, there's an expectation for you just going to say, good, how are you? Good, okay. And it's like, it ends up being or feeling insincere, even if people are really sincere about that. Whereas in Ethiopia, you're never going to get that sort of interaction. It's very much almost overwhelming. Like, you're like, oh my God, they've asked me like 8 times now. And whether or not they truly care, I'm made to believe that they do. And I'm going to actually answer sincerely. Doesn't mean that there aren't expectations that people are going to still be shallow about it and say, yeah, everything's great, or family's great. It's just more like, it's more inviting. The most important thing for people to understand about Ethiopia and Ethiopian culture is that, very much like any other African country or any country in any particular continent, it has its own identity. It has its own sense of diversity. It has its own very well-defined culture, and it should not be described in the context of the continent. For example, it pains me to hear people say, I'm from Africa. Like, in my eyes, it's like, it's misinformation, it's misrepresentative. Africa is a very diverse, large place with lots of different cultures. In Ethiopia alone, there are over 86 dialects and almost as many ethnic groups, and so that biodiversity, you miss out on that when someone says something so flatly as, I'm from Africa, or even if they said, I'm Ethiopian. Right? That doesn't quite get at that. There are a number of stereotypes about Ethiopians. I can't say exactly how many of them are positive or negative. It's all about the light, the person looking at it. Sort of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so I think, so too is positivity and negativity. What I can say about Ethiopians is that they're festive, they are devout in their religious pursuit, pretty conservative as a people overall, traditional, and sometimes I feel that Ethiopians are overly judgmental, are overly focused on what other people think versus like affirming their own inner voice or their own inner self, if you will. And I think that balance has been one I've had to learn to strike between my American identity and my Ethiopian identity, which is that in my American identity, there's an encouragement to really fully be in touch with my individual self and act from that place, and from the Ethiopian perspective, to be part of the collective and really act from that place. And so it's allowed me to create more of a balance around my tendency to want validation from the collective, for example, so that I can really be confident and secure in myself, and from that place I think I can contribute much more I can make a much more meaningful contribution as an individual. There are many feelings I have about America's current state. I would like to say, on a good day, I feel very optimistic about where this country is headed. On a bad day, I am really uncertain, and while I wouldn't call myself pessimistic or cynical, my tendency towards being realistic would lead me to believe that very much like you look at a petri dish, and certain things grow in a petri dish on the basis of what you added. So I think a lot about the U.S. culture in that way. I think that in many ways the culture could use some cleansing, purification, if you will. It's hard for me to understand the exact future of this country. I have decided, however, that I'm going to live here and be part of the solutions rather than just complaining about the problems. As of right now, we have a myriad of social problems, political problems, economic problems, and spiritual problems. I think fundamentally it must come down to a spiritual issue. I think one of the issues might in fact be that there is a particular secular energy that creates a division between the divinity of our existence as part of this ecological sort of existence and this tendency towards like materialism and like this sort of mechanistic sort of society. I feel very privileged to be alive at this time, especially watching how much technology has grown and boomed just in the last 10 to 20 years. I feel like I'm part of the generation that's seen what we can really gain as a society or as a global population from the advent of technology. At the same time, there's a real danger in the fact that the technology seems to be evolving at a much faster pace than we are. As a black man in the United States, it's hard to say that I feel blankly safe. That's because people don't necessarily know the depth of my identity. In fact, if they don't know who I am, and I'm kind of mixed in a bigger group of people, the average person will see me and they'll think or observe that person is black, and therefore he's part of the black population, the black community. Even though we know that the black community and the black population has a whole diverse, right? There can be black people from India, black people from Africa, there can be black people from Latin America. There could be, and from everywhere, right? So generally speaking, I do feel relatively safe. I think that has to do with the community in which I live and the way in which I steward my life. I do my best to take great care of myself, personal, on a physical level, emotional level, mental and spiritual level. Those lead me to have a particular type of optimism every day that I wake up. I sort of seize the day. I feel, because this is the way I really feel, I live a very affirmed life. Oftentimes my identity as a black man does not interfere with my ability to thrive in this culture. Whereas I don't believe that's true for all my peers who would identify as black men. I think there are many black men, especially enough of whom who are in the African American community, who have a very serious identification with being a black person, being otherized to white people, and their day-to-day experience. This is further compounded by economic status, education, intergenerational trauma, the history of chattel slavery, obviously existing racial climate. So it's not lost on me.